So it's time for my sowing guide for May and June. Normally I just take a quick look back at April, and so I'm going to do that now. And I'm just going to record my screen so you can see what I'm up to. There we go. So all the carrots that I sowed in April are germinated, as are almost all of the potatoes. So I'm really pleased about all that. Just slightly worried about any frosts in early May, but doesn't look like any frosts in the long range forecast. So I'm kind of getting a bit overconfident that I can do anything that I want now, and I might get caught out. Most of the squash are germinated, and quite a lot of the squash now are planted out in the polytunnel for an early crop. All of my brassicas are germinated and grown really nicely, and actually I'm going to be planting those out next week on Monday or Tuesday. So that'll be, what's that, probably the 2nd or 3rd of May probably. That is slightly earlier than I normally do it, but they've grown so well because it's been such a great April, and I'm generally guided as much by the plants and how they look as I am by their age. And so normally I will leave them for about 6 weeks, but yeah, they're looking great, so why not put them out. New Zealand spinach, all the ones I pricked out actually that self-seeded themselves, they've all taken. So I've planted some of those out, about half of them. I've saved the other half. Don't know what I'm going to do with the other half, but I don't need to sow any New Zealand spinach now. So although it's in my sowing guide to remind me for next year, when I just cut and paste this year's sowing guide into next year's, I'm actually not going to sow it. But if you don't have any to prick out that's self-seeded, April and May is the time to sow it. Chards doing okay. The French beans are all planted out in the polytunnel from the April sowing, and I'm just about to do my dwarf French beans, which I'll direct sow just because there's so many of them, into a little low tunnel on the allotment. I'll do that next week. My third succession of beetroot, they're all planted out now, and I've done loads of beetroot interplanting kind of experiments. I'll talk about that in a later video, but I think beetroot just lends itself to interplanting because it's quite slow to get started, and if you put quite big interplants in, then they can sort of be out of the bed by the time the beetroot is taking over. But also, you know, all the alliums are just great for interplanting into things like beetroot. So we'll see how that goes, but it went really nicely last year. Most of my parsnips are now up, maybe 2/3 of them are up, and the later successions are still to come up. I'm pretty hopeful. I think I've planted all the onions that I'm going to plant, but I've got one tray of onion sets that I sort of started off in trays just because I knew I wouldn't have anywhere to put them, and so they just kind of hold in their trays for a few weeks or so until I decide whether I can squeeze them in somewhere. So that's basically my approach to the last few onions. Loads and loads of spring onions in, and about, I don't know how many, I've got hundreds and hundreds to harvest. So everybody's getting abundant spring onions in the harvest at the moment. Just chitting my late April sweetcorns. I like to chit them. I found in the past that sometimes I get a very variable germination of sweetcorn, and because I do quite a few successions of it, I like to just pre-chit it so it's nice and reliable, because I'm only doing a small number, and if I get say 50% of germination, it mucks up my numbers. So it's easier to pre-germinate them so I know exactly which ones are viable, and and then I get, if I want 12, I get 12 for, in each succession type of thing. What we don't like doing is we don't like freezing very much, so we like eating fresh. So with the sweet corn, we'll do sort of 3 successions separated by a couple of weeks, so we get that nice kind of smooth staggered harvest over quite a long period of time. All my winter and summer squashes are sown, but they're not germinated yet. And that is fine because I don't really like planting those out until late April late May at the earliest. And my second succession of the tumbler tomatoes, they're just germinating now. The first succession are doing really nicely. We've got nice little tomatoes on those now in the hanging baskets in the polytunnel, so I'm really pleased with those. They seem to be working really nicely as an early tomato, better than anything that I've ever tried in the past. So I think that's me done with April. Let's have a quick look at May. Now, the vast majority of things I'm going to talk about in May, you can sow at any time in May. You could sow them in June. Some of them you could sow them in July and they'd be perfectly happy. So there's nothing really special about most of these dates. Where there is a special date, I'll mention it. For me, it's all about now just having space. So it's about having plants at the right time to take up bed space when it comes free, or at the right size to interplant into beds or relay plant into beds. So all my timing is nothing to do really with the actual plant and how well it will grow. It's all about having space, the right space for it really. So anyway, let's talk about it quickly. So I'm going to do 2 batches of climbing runner and French beans for a reason that I won't go into today, but normally I would do mine a little bit later than the first sowing that I've got on here, sort of the beginning of May. Normally I'd do them sort of towards the end of May, and the reason for that is that I have a batch in the polytunnel. I have my early dwarf French beans, so I don't really need early runner and climbing French beans, and so I just like to sow them a bit later. They're a bit more abundant then later on in the season, and I can even direct sow them in the soil if I wanted to. But this year, as I say, I won't go into the reasons why, but I am doing 1 batch early in May. And as I said, I've got like a placeholder for New Zealand spinach, so early May is a great time to do New Zealand spinach. It will then be ready to plant out in June, and you'll be eating it in July, which is sort of the time when your Asian spinach is running out. Golden purslane is a massive favourite for us in the summer salad boxes, and I did a sowing last month and the germination was terrible. I put like a pinch in each module, and you know, if there was 30% germination in those modules, I'd be surprised. So pretty awful. I've had to buy new seeds. I'll be sowing those in early May. It's not too much of a blow for me, to be honest, because the bed that I'm going to plant those into has got cauliflowers in, and they haven't even started to heart up yet. So, you know, actually might have done me a favour that these came late, although I always have a contingency sort of planting spot. I also have in my sowing log for May a few winter squashes, and generally this is again just contingency, just in case I lose a few. I don't want any bare spots in my squash beds, so I just put maybe 6 plants in or something like that in May, and then come sort of mid-June, if I've lost any, I've got those spares. I've got spares in the packets anyway, so it's no hardship just to sow a few. So the tumbler tomatoes, I've already mentioned, I've done 2 successions already, so this is my 3rd succession of tumbler tomatoes. I like doing successions of the little bush and hanging basket tomatoes because we really like tomatoes that are grown outside. We think they've got a bit better taste than the ones that are grown in the polytunnel, but of course they're shorter lived in terms of the harvest period, and they just come like in a big flush all at the same time, all in about a month's sort of period. So if you want them over a longer period, which we do, then it's best to just do a few successions. And again, there's a bit of contingency in that. I'm also going to do another batch of carrots. I don't really subscribe to this idea that you should do carrots every couple of weeks. I just think that's a lot of fuss and bother, given that carrots hold really well if you go out and buy the right varieties in the ground, and they don't degrade in taste or anything. They just get a little bit bigger. So if you like a mix of big and small carrots like I do, just plant them fairly close together. You know, so I generally use like an inch for my planting spacing for my summer carrots. I just harvest then the bigger ones and then that lets the smaller ones grow on. If I want some small ones for salads, then I just find the small ones in the bed and just harvest some of those, and then others grow on. It's just really flexible. You don't really need to do the every 2 weeks thing. So I generally do mine in big batches. I've generally sown almost all of my carrots by the end of May. I find, that's just the perfect time. June is pretty good as well, early June. It sort of gets more dodgy then as the months progress, although you can sow carrots kind of as late as August for a sort of harvest in winter, but for me there's just no point. Having said that, I do like to sow carrots in late October and early November, and they're the ones I'm harvesting right now, and they're gorgeous. And that's the best way that I know of to get really good new season carrots in May, just as, to the day, my overwintered carrots are, the ones that I planted in May and June, just as they're finishing these new season ones already. Of course, I'm always doing successions of lettuce, so we won't talk about those. As I said, I'm doing successions of sweet corn. I won't talk any more about those, but I will talk about purple sprouting broccoli. We really like purple sprouting broccoli. I think a lot of people do. It's not the most productive crop, so we make sure to eat a few leaves off the plants as well as eating the actual florets. But we like it in a way more than cauliflowers, just because it gives us that long continuous kind of harvest period that we're so fond of, because we don't freeze stuff. And so we're going 3 different varieties of purple sprouting broccoli. So we're doing claret, which is the latest of the purple, well, maybe not the latest, but it's a late one. So it's the one we've just finished the last harvest of as we come out of April and into May. So it's generally harvested in that April period, sometimes a little bit into May. But it's very prolific because it's a late variety. The late varieties are the most prolific varieties. So if you wanted just one thing to grow, one purple sprouting broccoli, for a big harvest that you then froze and ate over the year, for example, then you would do an April flowering one. We're also going to do Red Admiral and Red Fire, and those kind of give us a harvest from sort of December, January period through to March, April, sort of, early April sort of period, and then the claret kicks in. So it gives us that really nice, smooth, kind of continuous harvest all the way through winter and spring. So it's a great way, if you don't want to fuss around with cauliflowers. We will do a few cauliflowers though, having said that. We don't grow every cauliflower that we can eat, but we certainly grow a substantial proportion. And so I'm going to do the purple varieties in the main, and also kind of Romanescos and things like that, just because, they just look nicer really, and they're healthier than the white cauliflowers. Then another succession of tumbler, and then that's probably my last succession, I don't know. We'll see as I go through this guide. And then I'm going to do some collards. And the reason I do collards is we find that we rely heavily on kales for our leafy greens, all sorts of different kales, I could get half a dozen different kales. But we do find the kind of, quality and volume of them kind of dips as we go into sort of late autumn through winter, and then they kick off again in spring. But that's the time really where the collards kind of have a nice role to play. So we'll put a few collards in, and there's quite a range of collards that I'm doing. I'll just pop that up. So you can see those: Champion, Vates, Flash, and Austrian tree cabbage is not a collard, but I sort of include it in that category. And then another succession of sweet corn, and then beetroot. Now, as I said, I've got loads of beetroot in the ground, multiple successions of them. I'll start harvesting those probably in May. We've got beetroot in store, of course, so just as we're running out of beetroot in store, we start harvesting sort of baby beetroots in May. So these are the storage beetroot crop. Now, there is some debate about the best time to do storage beetroot. I'm tending to do it now a little bit earlier than most people recommend. It does depend a little bit where you sow it. If you're sowing it in a sort of really shady spot, it will grow, but it'll grow much slower. So if you're taking it out in October, and I almost always take mine out in October so that I can get my winter crops planted, things like field beans or garlic or overwintered onions and things like that. So I want it out by October, which means it's only got that kind of growing period from sort of May, June sort of time through to October. And as I say, in a shady spot, you need to sow it a little bit earlier. In a very sunny spot, you could probably get away with sowing it in June to plant out in July, and you'd still get decent sized storage beetroot in October. Some people leave it in the ground, of course, and actually, can keep harvesting it even now out of the ground. Although there is a risk that it's going to be woody if you do that, and also slug eaten and all of that. But also, you've just occupied the ground for all of that period of time, and it stores so incredibly well just in damp wood chips that we want the ground to grow things, and we're quite happy to stick it in the garage to store it. Anyway, going back, I'm going to do 2 successions of beetroot for storage, and I probably will only use one of them. I might put the others in and try and get a harvest out of them for some in another spot, but really I only need one of these successions. So what's the reason that I'm doing 2 successions? It's because I'm planting them into beds that have got garlic in them at the moment and overwintered onions, and those are the 2 very important crops. And I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to pull those crops and get space to put the onions in. And I don't, because there's quite a lot of disruption when you take those crops out because they're quite deep. I don't want to disrupt the onion seedlings by interplanting them into those beds. So that means, because I'm not sure exactly whether it's going to be mid-June or late June or early July even for the overwintered onions, but it could be as early as the early June, I'm going to do 2 successions. It doesn't cost me very much. It's like 3 trays of seed compost. It's like 50p or something to do 2 successions, but it just gives me that flexibility that no matter what happens with those crops, I'll still have beetroot ready to plant pretty much instantly that those garlic and overwintered onions are ready. And then finally for April, the beans, and so I'm going to do Lady Di and Hunter, which is a kind of cross between a runner bean and a French bean. It's really quite nice. And Cobra, which is just a bog standard climbing French bean. And so that's the time I normally do mine, as I say, just because I don't want them to overlap with the dwarf French beans that I'll be doing at the beginning of May. So that's May. Let's have a very quick look at June. And this is kind of very much an outline plan for June, because I don't really plan too far ahead. I just have a rough idea of what I'm doing. So I am going to do some Calabrese. I always just use Marathon. It works for every succession I do, no matter what time of year. I'll just do a few of those. It says here 10, but that's the kind of default that I always put. It'd probably be more like 6. Just a few for eating in autumn. Might not do these cauliflowers, but I might. Again, just kind of depends on how I'm feeling, how much bed space I think I've got available. But a couple of nice varieties for an autumn harvest, Moby Dick and Northfoundlander, I think it is. Then I'll do the kales that are going to be my main kind of autumn and early winter crop. Reflex, and let's pop those up so we can see Reflex, Nero and Black Magic. 3 nice varieties there. Nothing special about them though. And then, as I said, there's my second succession there of beetroot. and I think it's about 20 days after the first succession. And yeah, carrots. Oh yeah, so if I end up having a spare bed in the back garden for some reason, sometimes happens, you know, sometimes, for example, my lettuce might get lettuce aphid and I just pull the bed, and then in that case it's kind of, what do I plant? I won't have anything kind of just waiting to plant out. So sometimes I just sow not radish, well sometimes I could sow radish, but sometimes I sow carrots in there. Carrots are one of our kind of default crops. If we get a bit of space in June, we might just pop carrots in there, just because they're such a popular crop for us, and we can eat as many as we can grow. Another batch of lettuce, of course, always doing little batches of lettuce, even though we do harvest individual leaves most of the time. We do really like some of the little gem and amaze, which are little hearting lettuces, really crispy and crunchy, same word isn't it really, in summer. And then this is my second batch of the same 3 varieties of purple sprouting broccoli. So it's a funny thing really with purple sprouting broccoli. It's all down to the variety as to when it flowers, but also if you separate your sowings by a couple of weeks, it also separates the flowering period by maybe again a couple of weeks, so you just get a little bit of a smoother harvest period. Otherwise it kind of looks a little bit like this, and as I say, if you separate your sowings by 2 weeks, it just kind of, it's more like a not very good at that, am I? More of a little wave anyway. So that's what I do, and again, it's slightly, you know, there's a lot of contingency thinking in the way that I do things, in that even though I only separate these sowings by 2 weeks, if, for example, I lost the first batch due to slugs or something like that, or the pigeons got them, or who knows what might happen, that second batch, even if it's planted in adjacent beds, might just survive. So you know, and it wouldn't make much difference to our harvest in winter and spring, but you know, sometimes 2 weeks is enough diversity to safeguard you from some sort of disaster. So I like to always just play around with little things like that. And then maybe again, if I've got space, and I'll probably sow these, I don't know whether I'll use them because they're not a very high value crop for us, but these are the radicchios. So we would use those in salads in sort of November, December period, when salads are a bit in short supply because everything's really slowing down at that period. Radicchio is quite a nice addition to the salads. Its main advantage is it's quite crunchy and it looks beautiful. And, you know, well, that's all you need to say really. The only thing is it's a little bit bitter, and it's not the favourite ingredient in salads. We've got a few people who don't like it at all, some people who say it's okay, it's not my favourite, and other people who really like it. So we do, if we have a bit of space, we'll do a few. But my main focus now for the kind of, you know, December, January period of salads is to supplement my salad crop with ones that I grow on these grow lights here behind me, just because they look really lovely in the conservatory. I've got the lights on anyway because of seasonal effectiveness disorder, so it's kind of a win-win. It's just, you know, I like to be surrounded by things that are growing, and beautiful lettuces are a great thing to grow. So that's it for me for June, and yeah, well, we'll be back again with another What Am I Sowing and What Am I Growing guide in June. But by then, the June plan will be firmed up. As I say, I will do this June guide now, so it's 2 months ahead, or a month, I suppose it's a month ahead, just because a lot of people have requested it just for forward planning purposes. Of course, you could just look at last year's what I sowed in June, and that probably serves as good a guide as anything. But anyway, I decided to do it. Helps me get ahead with my planning a little bit and start the thought process going a month early, so it's not all a mad rush at the end of April. My name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and if you want more details of all the things that I do, just look down there in the description and you'll find links to everything basically that you need. See you soon.